My brother used my credit card to pay for his entire wedding, and I had no idea until the bank called me just 10 minutes before the ceremony. At first, I thought someone had stolen my information. Then the fraud specialist started reading the charges one by one. $14,000 for the wedding venue. $9,800 for the caterer. $6,200 for the honeymoon. The flowers, the photographer, the band, and so much more. Every payment matched the wedding I was about to attend. As I looked through the venue entrance, I realized I had unknowingly paid more than $52,000 for the happiest day of my brother's life. I didn't scream or confront anyone. I simply thanked the bank representative and walked back inside with the call still connected. Looking back now, that phone call didn't just expose stolen money. It uncovered years of lies. My name is Nyla Mercer, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the dependable one in my family. I worked hard, built a successful career, and protected my credit because I knew how important financial security was. Whenever my parents needed help, I stepped in without expecting anything in return. If there was an emergency bill or an unexpected expense, I found a way to help. I believe that's what family did. My younger brother, Brett, lived a very different life. He jumped from one bad decision to another, yet somehow never faced real consequences. Our parents always found a way to excuse his mistakes, calling him unlucky instead of irresponsible. I tried not to resent it because he was still my brother. On the morning of his wedding, I was honestly excited for him. He looked happier than I had ever seen him, and I hoped this new chapter would finally help him grow up. I never imagined that before he could even say his vows, one phone call would reveal the biggest betrayal my family had ever hidden from me. I stepped away from the entrance and found a quiet corner where I could think. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Can you read every transaction again?" I asked Erin from the bank's fraud department. I needed to know exactly what had happened before I made another move. She patiently went through the list one payment at a time. As she spoke, every charge painted a picture I knew all too well. The ballroom where the ceremony was about to begin. The florist Ria had proudly shown us on her phone. The photographer Brett insisted was worth every penny. The live band everyone had been talking about for weeks. The tuxedo, the rehearsal dinner, the honeymoon package, and even the wedding rings. Nothing was random. Every dollar had been spent on the celebration happening just a few feet away from me. I closed my eyes, hoping there was some mistake, but there wasn't. Erin explained that the charges had been made over the previous 3 months. Even more confusing, my physical credit card had never been used. According to their records, someone had entered my card details online and completed the purchases without needing the actual card. Then a memory hit me so suddenly that it made my stomach turn. A few months earlier, Brett had stopped by my apartment saying Dad needed some insurance information. He told me he had forgotten part of the policy number and asked if he could borrow my wallet for a minute because my insurance card was inside. I hadn't thought twice about it. He disappeared into the next room for a couple of minutes before returning everything exactly as it had been. At the time it felt completely normal. Now it felt like the moment everything began. "He copied my card," I whispered. Erin asked if I wanted to report the fraud immediately. She explained that the bank could start freezing accounts and begin the investigation right away. I looked through the glass doors at my family laughing together, completely unaware that my world had just fallen apart. "No," I said after a long silence. "Not yet. I needed answers before I involved the police. I wanted to know whether Brett had acted alone or if someone else had helped him. I couldn't believe he had spent over $52,000 without anyone asking where the money came from. I asked Erin if she could remain available in case I called back. She agreed and gave me her direct extension. I slipped my phone into my purse, took one deep breath, and walked back toward the ceremony. This was no longer just about stolen money. I was about to find out how many people I could no longer trust. I walked back into the venue as if nothing had happened. The music was playing, guests were smiling, and everyone was focused on the wedding. I forced myself to smile whenever someone looked my way, but my attention wasn't on the celebration anymore. I watched every face, every conversation, every reaction. I wasn't looking for happiness. I was looking for guilt. The ceremony passed in a blur. I barely heard the vows because my mind kept replaying the list of charges. Every decoration around me suddenly looked different. Instead of seeing flowers and lights, I saw dollar amounts. Every beautiful detail reminded me that someone had taken my money without asking. When dinner began, I decided to start with my parents. I waited until the conversation slowed down before speaking. This wedding must have cost a fortune, I said as casually as I could. How did Brett manage to pay for all of this? I thought he was still trying to get out of debt. My father, Dean, stopped eating for a moment. My mother, Paula, looked down at her plate instead of answering. It was only a few seconds, but it was long enough for me to notice. I continued calmly. The bank called me today. They believe someone has been using my credit card information. Neither of them looked surprised. They didn't ask what happened. They didn't question whether the bank had made a mistake. They simply exchanged a quick glance. That silent look told me more than words ever could. Finally, my mother let out a slow breath. Brett borrowed your card information, she said quietly. He said it was only temporary. He promised he'd pay you back after the wedding. I stared at her, unable to believe what I had just heard. You knew? I asked. She nodded without meeting my eyes. Before I could say another word, my father leaned forward. Don't make this into something bigger than it is, he said. He's your brother. Families help each other. I never agreed to this, I replied. Dean shrugged. You have a good job. You've always landed on your feet. Brett was under a lot of pressure, and this wedding meant everything to him. We figured you'd understand once it was over. His words hurt more than the stolen money. They hadn't simply defended Brett. They had decided my hard work belonged to him. They believed they had the right to spend my money without even asking because they expected me to quietly accept it, just as I always had before. At that table, surrounded by relatives celebrating love and family, I realized I wasn't seen as a daughter or a sister. I was simply the person expected to pay whenever everyone else ran out of options. After my conversation with my parents, I knew there was no point pulling Brett aside for a private discussion. If they already knew what he had done and still expected me to accept it, then this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice they had all been willing to live with. As the guests settled into the reception, I stood up and gently tapped my glass with a spoon. I'd like to make a toast, I said with a smile. People happily lifted their glasses. Brett grinned at me from the head table, probably expecting a heartfelt speech about family and new beginnings. Ria smiled too, completely unaware of what was about to happen. I began by congratulating them and wishing them a happy marriage. Then I placed my phone on the table between us. I'd also like everyone to hear something important. I pressed one button. The speaker came alive and Aaron's calm, professional voice filled the room. Hello. My name is Aaron Sloan from the bank's Fraud Investigation Department. The conversation stopped almost instantly. Aaron began reading the transactions exactly as they appeared in the records. March 8. $14,000 paid to Grand Oak Ballroom. She continued without emotion. March 22. $9,800 to Sterling Catering. One by one she listed the photographer, the florist, the band, the tuxedo rental, the rehearsal dinner, the honeymoon package, and the wedding rings. Every charge included the date and amount. The room became so quiet that I could hear glasses being set back onto the tables. I looked toward Ria. The smile had disappeared from her face. She slowly turned to Brett, searching his expression for an explanation. Across the room, a few vendors exchanged confused looks as they recognized the invoices Aaron was describing. Brett forced out a nervous laugh. Come on, he said. This is a misunderstanding. He looked around the room before pointing at me. Nyla offered to pay. It was her wedding gift to us. I met his eyes without raising my voice. That's a serious claim, I said. Please show everyone the message where I agreed to that. He reached for his phone. The confidence on his face faded as he unlocked the screen. He scrolled through old texts, opened emails, checked messages, then paused. Nothing. I waited. So, I asked quietly, do you have a single text, email, voicemail, or signed agreement where I gave you permission to use my credit card? He didn't answer. His hands slowly dropped to his sides. The silence that followed was louder than any argument could have been. In front of every guest, every relative, and every person who had helped create this wedding, the truth had nowhere left to hide. The silence didn't last long. Guests started whispering to one another, and within seconds those whispers became questions directed at Brett. Everyone wanted the same answer. If I hadn't agreed to pay, then where had the money come from? Brett looked around the room, searching for a way out. Nyla just forgot, he said quickly. We talked about it months ago. I folded my arms. Then tell everyone when that conversation happened. He opened his mouth but nothing came out. A moment later he changed his story. My parents knew about it, he said, pointing toward Mom and Dad. They approved everything. Every pair of eyes turned toward them. Neither of them spoke. Their silence only made the situation worse. Seeing that excuse fail, Brett tried again. I was always going to pay her back, he insisted. After the wedding we'd get cash gifts and I'd start making payments. I wasn't trying to steal anything. His words sounded weaker every time he spoke. Rhea stepped away from him, tears filling her eyes. You told me you got promoted, she said quietly. You said that's how we could finally afford the wedding. Brett couldn't even look at her. I was going to explain later, he mumbled. Several vendors who were still attending the reception began speaking up. The photographer confirmed Brett had personally signed the service agreement. The venue manager said Brett introduced himself as the person responsible for every payment. The wedding planner nodded and explained that every decision had gone through him. One after another they all told the same story. Nobody had been dealing with me. Everyone had been dealing with Brett. My phone was still on the table when Erin spoke again. I need to make something clear, she said in her calm professional voice. Using another person's credit card information without permission may qualify as identity theft and financial fraud. These matters are taken very seriously. The words seemed to drain the last bit of confidence from Brett's face. A member of the venue staff quietly approached and informed us that officers assigned outside for traffic control had been notified about the possible fraud. They weren't rushing into the room or creating panic, but they were waiting nearby in case they were needed. For years, every problem in my family had been handled behind closed doors. Excuses were made, apologies were accepted, and everyone moved on as if nothing had happened. Standing in that reception hall, I finally understood those days were over. This wasn't a private family disagreement anymore. There were witnesses, signed contracts, bank records, and professionals who had already documented everything. The truth had grown too large to hide, and no amount of pleading or excuses could force it back into the shadows. As the reception slowly came apart, people stopped pretending everything was normal. Some guests quietly left, while others gathered in small groups, trying to understand what had happened. The music had been turned off and the joyful atmosphere was gone. I stood near one of the windows, exhausted from everything that had unfolded. That's when my great-aunt Evelyn walked over and gently touched my arm. There are things you deserve to know, she said softly. She wasn't the only one. One by one, older relatives began sharing stories I had never heard before. They spoke carefully, almost as if they had carried these secrets for years and were finally tired of keeping them. My grandfather had loved both Brett and me equally. Before he passed away, he had arranged for each of us to receive the same financial gift to help us start our adult lives. I remembered hearing about it years ago, but I had never actually seen the money. I always assumed it had gone into savings. It hadn't. My aunt explained that Brett received his share first and spent it within a couple of years. When his debt started piling up, my parents quietly took the money Grandpa had left for me and used it to cover Brett's bills. They never asked my permission because I was still young, and they never told me afterward. I felt my stomach tighten. Another relative shook his head. Your grandfather would have been heartbroken if he'd known. Before I could even process that, another truth came out. Over the years, my parents had borrowed money from several family members whenever Brett got himself into trouble. Every time they told the same story. Nyla knows about it. Nyla said she'd help. Nyla will pay everyone back. I had never agreed to any of it. Some relatives admitted they believed I had approved those decisions because my parents sounded so confident. Others said they always wondered why I never mentioned the loans myself. The answers were suddenly clear. I hadn't known because nobody wanted me to know. For years, my hard work had become a family safety net that everyone else felt free to use. Every promotion I earned, every overtime shift I worked, every careful financial decision I made had quietly benefited someone who never accepted responsibility for his own choices. The wedding wasn't the beginning of the betrayal. It was simply the first time I had caught them. Standing there, I looked across the room at my parents. They weren't just protecting Brett from the consequences of his actions. They had spent years convincing themselves that my success belonged to the entire family, while my dreams, my savings, and even my future were things they could spend whenever Brett needed another rescue. For the first time in my life, everything finally made sense. The week after the wedding felt strangely quiet. My phone kept buzzing with messages from relatives, friends, and even people who had attended the reception. Some wanted to know what happened. Others apologized for not seeing the truth sooner. I thanked those who reached out, but I spent most of my time focused on something far more important. I officially reported the fraud. The bank had already opened its investigation, but now I completed every document they requested. I also filed a police report and handed over everything I had, including the transaction records, my phone calls with Aaron, and every message connected to the case. Soon after, I hired attorney Miles Avery. He listened carefully before saying, "The facts matter more than emotions. If the evidence supports your claim, we'll let it speak for itself." That was exactly what happened. As the investigation moved forward, new proof appeared almost every day. Surveillance videos from several businesses showed Brett making payments and discussing wedding arrangements. Store employees identified him without hesitation. He wasn't acting like someone spending another person's money by mistake. He behaved like the customer in charge. The paperwork told the same story. Contracts for the venue, catering, photography, music, and travel all carried Brett's signature. His phone number and email address appeared throughout the documents. Everything pointed directly to him. Several business owners also gave statements. More than one of them remembered Brett proudly explaining that his sister was paying for everything because she wanted him to have the perfect wedding. Hearing those words made me realize how easily he had used my name to gain people's trust. Then my parents came to see me. They looked exhausted. My mother cried almost the entire conversation. My father tried to stay calm, but I could hear the fear in his voice. "If you don't withdraw the complaint," he said, "Brett could be charged with serious crimes. This could follow him for the rest of his life." I looked at both of them. "Did either of you worry about my future before letting him steal my identity?" I asked. Neither answered. Mom reached for my hand. "Please," she whispered. "He's your brother." I slowly pulled my hand away. "I've spent my whole life protecting him," I said. "Every time he made a mistake, someone expected me to fix it. That ends now." The room fell silent. "This isn't revenge," I continued. "It's accountability. He made these choices. He signed the contracts. He used my credit card without permission. Those decisions belong to him, not me." I stood up and walked them to the door. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying Brett's mistakes on my shoulders. I was finally letting him face the weight of his own actions. Once the investigation was officially underway, the situation moved far beyond my family. What had started as a shocking phone call before a wedding quickly became a legal and financial case involving banks, businesses, and insurance companies. Every organization connected to the payments began reviewing its records, and the truth spread faster than anyone expected. Several luxury vendors discovered that the transactions tied to my credit card were under investigation. Those who had rented expensive decorations, furniture, and equipment immediately canceled their agreements and arranged to collect their property. The wedding had already ended, but many of the rented items still hadn't been returned. Within days, trucks arrived to recover everything they legally could. The honeymoon never happened. The travel agency canceled the reservation after receiving notice that the payment was being disputed. Flights were refunded to the bank while the investigation continued, and the hotel booking disappeared before Brett and Rhea could even leave town. Insurance didn't help either. Some people in my family believed an insurance claim would solve everything, but they were wrong. Once fraud became part of the investigation, reimbursement was denied. The companies involved made it clear they wouldn't cover losses connected to unauthorized financial activity. The hardest part to watch was Rhea. She had entered the marriage believing Brett had worked hard, earned a promotion, and saved enough money to build a future with her. Instead, she learned that nearly every part of their wedding had been built on lies. She packed a suitcase and moved in with her sister, saying she needed time away to decide whether she could ever trust him again. Meanwhile, my parents were facing problems of their own. My father withdrew a large portion of his retirement savings to pay legal fees, hoping expensive attorneys could somehow undo what had already been proven. My mother barely slept. Every conversation we had ended with tears. She admitted she had convinced herself that keeping Brett's secret was an act of love, but now she saw the damage it had caused. For years, Someone had always stepped in to rescue Brett before things became too serious. My parents paid his debts. Relatives offered loans. I covered emergencies without asking questions. This time was different. There were no shortcuts left, no hidden solution, and no one willing to erase the consequences. For the first time in his life, Brett stood completely alone, facing the results of choices that nobody else could fix. Watching everything fall apart wasn't satisfying. It was simply the unavoidable outcome of years spent believing that someone else would always clean up the mess he created. Several months passed before the case finally reached the courtroom. By then, the shock of the wedding had faded, but the facts had only become stronger. Every investigation had added another piece of evidence, creating a clear picture of what had happened. I wasn't nervous because I knew the truth no longer depended on my word alone. The bank presented detailed records showing every unauthorized transaction. Investigators explained how my credit card information had been used over several months without my knowledge. Security footage from stores and businesses showed Brett making purchases connected to the wedding. Contracts carried his signature along with his phone number and email address. Business owners and employees testified that they had dealt directly with him throughout the planning process. Even his own messages became part of the evidence. They showed him discussing payments, confirming reservations, and telling people everything had been taken care of. There was no sign that I had ever agreed to finance his wedding. When Brett finally took the stand, he looked very different from the confident groom I had seen months earlier. He avoided looking at me for most of the hearing. After answering several questions, he quietly admitted something that stayed with me. "I didn't think she'd report me," he said. "She always forgave me before." Those words explained more than he probably realized. He hadn't believed he was untouchable because he was clever. He believed it because everyone around him had spent years protecting him from consequences. He expected this time to end the same way. When it was my turn to speak, I looked at the judge instead of my brother. "Yes, the money matters," I said. "It took years of hard work to build my savings and protect my credit. But losing money isn't the deepest wound. The hardest part is realizing that the people I trusted believed they had the right to take from me without asking." The courtroom remained silent as I finished. I came here because trust has value too. If I stayed silent, I would be telling everyone that this was acceptable. It isn't. After reviewing all the evidence, the judge delivered the decision. Brett was ordered to repay the money he had stolen. He also received criminal penalties for fraud and identity theft. The sentence couldn't erase what had happened, but it made one thing clear. Actions have consequences. As I walked out of the courthouse, I expected to feel anger or sadness. Instead, I felt lighter than I had in years. For so long, I had carried responsibilities that were never mine. That burden was finally gone. For the first time, I wasn't living to fix someone else's mistakes. I was finally free to live my own life. Almost a year passed before I truly felt like my life belonged to me again. The legal process was behind me, my credit had been fully restored, and most of the money Brett had taken was recovered through the court's order. It hadn't happened overnight, but little by little, everything I had worked so hard to build was finally back where it belonged. The biggest change wasn't in my bank account. It was in the way I lived. For the first time, I stopped feeling responsible for fixing everyone else's problems. I no longer answered every desperate phone call or rushed to solve situations I didn't create. I learned that setting boundaries wasn't selfish. It was necessary. A few months later, I signed the papers for my first home. Walking through the front door with my own keys in my hand felt different from every achievement that had come before it. Every room represented years of discipline, patience, and determination. This house wasn't built on anyone else's sacrifices. It was built on my own hard work. One quiet evening, as I was unpacking another box, my phone rang. The number wasn't familiar. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. "Hello." There was a long pause before I heard Brett's voice. "It's me." He sounded calmer than I had ever heard him. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. "I just needed to tell you that I'm sorry." I stayed silent and let him continue. "I stole more than your money," he admitted. "I stole your trust. I let Mom and Dad convince me that you would always take care of me. I kept believing I deserved your help without ever earning it." His voice cracked. I was wrong. There was no excuse this time. No blaming our parents. No promises that it had all been a misunderstanding. Just an honest apology. I believed he meant every word. But believing someone is sincere isn't the same as pretending the past never happened. I appreciate your apology, I told him. I truly hope you build a better life from here. But some things can't be repaired simply because we're family. He quietly said he understood. We wished each other well before ending the call. I placed my phone on the kitchen counter and looked around my new home. Sunlight was coming through the windows, filling the empty rooms with warmth and possibility. I smiled for the first time that day. The bank's phone call before my brother's wedding had felt like the worst moment of my life. Now I understood it had been the beginning of my freedom. It didn't destroy my future. It finally gave me the chance to build one that belonged completely to me. Family should be built on trust, not sacrifice. Tell me your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more emotional stories that stay with you long after they end.